Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
that you will
Good morning, and welcome back to the American Culturist, the show where we unapologetically celebrate the greatest civilization the world has ever known, the one built on Enlightenment reason, individual liberty, Christian moral foundations, and the conservative conviction that some cultures are simply superior to others because they value truth, beauty, and human flourishing over fanaticism and submission. Last episode, we looked at what the science says about biological sex, gender dysphoria, and the medical establishment's increasingly troubled relationship with its own evidence base. Today, we're going somewhere different. We're going further back, much further back, to the philosophical foundations that Western civilization was built on, and we're going to ask a question that nobody in this debate seems interested in asking. What would the greatest thinkers of the history of Western philosophy actually say about the gender ideology movement if they were sitting across from us today? Because here's the thing about Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics. They weren't conservatives in the modern political sense. They weren't Christians. They weren't Americans. They had no dog in our culture war. What they had was something rarer and more valuable than any of that. They had a rigorous, systematic commitment to understanding reality as it actually is, and a deep suspicion of anyone who tried to substitute comfortable feeling for hard truth. When you apply their framework honestly to the central claims of gender ideology, the conclusions are not ambiguous, they are devastating. Let's start with Plato, because Plato gives us the most direct philosophical tools for this conversation. And to understand Plato's relevance here, you need to understand his theory on forms, and one of the most influential ideals in the entire history of Western thought. Plato believed that the physical world we perceive with our senses, the world of objects, bodies, sensations, and feelings, is not the most real world. It's a world of shadows, imperfect and constantly changing representations of something deeper and more permanent that exists behind it. He called these deeper realities forms. Forms are the eternal, unchanging, objective essences of things, what something truly is, stripped of all of its imperfect physical instantiation. The form of justice isn't any particular just act, it's the timeless ideal of justice itself, which all just acts imperfectly reflect. The form of beauty isn't any beautiful face or painting, it's the eternal essence of beauty that beautiful things participate in. And at the top of the whole hierarchy sits the form of the good, the ultimate ground of all reality and the source of truth, being, and intelligibility itself. Now, here's where this becomes directly relevant to our conversation. Plato was absolutely categorical on one point. Truth is objective, unchanging, and independent of human perception or desire. Truth is not what seems true to you, not what you feel to be true, not what your culture tells you is true. Truth is objective and unchanging, existing in the realm of forms as ideal and eternal essences that represent the highest reality. Plato spent much of his philosophical career arguing against the sophists, the paid rhetoricians of ancient Athens who taught that truth was relative, that persuasion was more important than reality, and that whatever argument wins the debate is effectively true. Plato found this not just philosophically wrong, but morally dangerous, because a civilization that abandons objective truth in favor of subjective feeling or social consensus has lost its ability to distinguish between wisdom and manipulation. The most famous illustration of this is the Allegory of the Cave from Plato's Republic. Imagine prisoners chained in a cave from birth facing a wall. Behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, objects are carried back and forth, casting shadows on the wall. The prisoners have never seen anything else. The shadows are their entire reality. They name the shadows, debate the shadows, and build entire systems of knowledge about the shadows, all without ever knowing that what they are seeing isn't the thing itself, but only its projection. Truth, Plato tells us, is objective and serves as the ground of human reality, regardless of our animated rants and machinations to the contrary. The allegory places on display what Plato saw as the eternal conflict between appearance and reality, between what things seem to be and what they actually are. Now, apply that directly to the central claim of gender ideology that a person's subjective experience of their gender identity is the authoritative, defining truth of who they are, and that biological sex, the observable, chromosomal, gamete producing physical reality of the body, is merely a social construct that can be overridden by that subjective experience. Plato would immediately recognize this as cave thinking. It's the substitution of the shadow, the eternal feeling, and the subjective perception for the form itself. It's the prisoners debating the shapes on the wall and insisting that their debate constitutes knowledge of reality, while refusing to turn around and look at the actual objects casting the shadow. For Plato, the forms were not just philosophical ideas, but represented the very structure of reality. They are what give meaning to the physical objects and the experiences we encounter, providing a standard by which we can understand their true nature. And biological sex, on a Platonic analysis, isn't a social construct, it's a participation in a form. The form of maleness and the form of femaleness are real, objective, and not subjective to revision by subjective feeling. But Plato goes further still, and this is the part that most directly applies to our cultural moment. In the Phaedrus and elsewhere, Plato and Socrates make striking observations about false words. Plato wrote that false words are not only evil in themselves, but that they infect the soul with evil. This wasn't a throwaway line. It was a deep considered philosophical claim about what happens to a person in a society when language is systematically decoupled from truth. When we are compelled to call a man a woman, when we are required to affirm a biological reality as false and a feeling as fact, when our institutions from medicine to law to education systematically use language in ways that contradict observable truth, we are not just being polite. We are doing something that Plato considered spiritually and philosophically catastrophic. We're training souls to prefer comfortable shadows to difficult truth. And once you've accepted that truth, shift based on cultural habits and feeling, you have no firm philosophical ground left to stand on. Now, let's turn to Aristotle, because Aristotle gives us a different but equally powerful framework and one that cuts even more directly to the heart of the matter. Where Plato was most interested in the realm of eternal forms, Aristotle was most interested in the natural world as it actually exists. And Aristotle's central contribution to understanding nature was this concept of teleology, the idea that everything in nature has a telos, a proper end or purpose toward which it's oriented by its very nature. Natural teleology contends natural entities have intrinsic purposes, regardless of human use or opinion. Aristotle claimed that an acorn's intrinsic telos is to become a fully grown oak tree. The telos isn't imposed from the outside, it's inherited in the nature of the thing itself. The eye's telos is to see, the heart's telos is to pump blood, the acorn's telos is to become an oak. And crucially, for our purposes, the telos of the male human reproductive system is to produce sperm and participate in reproduction as a male, and the telos of a female human reproductive system is to produce eggs and participate in the reproduction as a female. This isn't a moral judgment in the first instance, it's a biological and philosophical observation. For Aristotle, a full explanation of anything must consider its final cause, its telos, as well as its material and formal causes. You can't fully understand what something is without understanding what it's for, and the telos of biological sex isn't ambiguous. It isn't culturally constructed, and it isn't subject to revision by subjective experience. It's written into the biological reality of the organism at the most fundamental level. Aristotle also had a highly developed concept of what it means to flourish as a human being, what he called eudaimonia, often translated as happiness or flourishing. It isn't the affirmation of every feeling. It's the actualization of our highest capacities, including person, reason, virtue, relationship, and the full realization of what we actually are. And what we actually are, on an Aristotelian account, is embodied rational animals whose bodily reality is not incidental to our identity but constitutive of it. The body isn't a prison the self is trapped in. It's the physical actualization of the human form with its own telos, its own proper function, and its own contribution to the flourishing of the whole person. A gender ideology that tells a person their body is wrong, that the material reality of their physical sex is an obstacle to their authentic self rather than an integral part of who they are, would strike Aristotle as a profound philosophical error. It treats the body as accidental rather than essential, as obstacle rather than an integral component of the person's telos. And a medical system that responds to this belief by surgically altering the body to approximate the opposite sex, rather than addressing the psychological and philosophical confusion at the root, would look to Aristotle less like medicine and more like trying to make the acorn into a pine tree by carving it. Then there are the Stoics, and the Stoics bring a third and distinctly practical dimension to this conversation. Stoicism was founded in Athens around 300 BC by Zeno of Citium, and its central ethical command was straightforward: live in accordance with nature. But the Stoics meant something precise and philosophically rich by this. Central to Stoic ethics was the idea of living in accordance with nature, which meant aligning one's life with reason and the rational order of the universe. The Stoics called this rational order the logos, the divine intelligence woven into the fabric of reality itself, governing everything from the movement of the planets to the structure of the human soul. For the Stoics, living in accordance with nature meant living in a way consistent with our own human nature. They believed that humans were rational beings, capable of reason and self reflection, and that by using our rational faculties to understand and appreciate the natural world, we could live more meaningful and purposeful lives. The key word here is rational. Stoics distinguished sharply between our rational nature, the capacity for reason and virtue that constitutes our highest self, and our passions, appetites, and feelings, which they treated as potentially valuable but fundamentally unreliable guides to truth and action. Passion and feelings were to be examined by reason, not obeyed blindly. The Stoic path to flourishing wasn't the satisfaction of every desire. It was the disciplined application of reason to distinguish what's truly good for us from what merely feels good in the moment. Apply that framework to a culture that tells young people to follow their feelings about their gender identity without question, to treat those feelings as the authoritative truth of who they are, and to make irreversible medical decisions based on them before they've even fully developed the rational faculties to evaluate them, and you have something the Stoics would have considered a profound failure of reason. Not because the feelings aren't real. The Stoics didn't deny that passions and desires are real experiences, but the Stoics defined the good as what is complete according to nature for a rational being as a rational being. Feelings untested by reason, desires unexamined by philosophy, and self perceptions unchallenged by honest inquiry into the nature of things aren't wisdom. They're the starting point of the inquiry, not its conclusion. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor whose meditations remain one of the most widely read philosophical texts in Western history, wrote repeatedly about the importance of seeing things as they actually are rather than as we wish them to be. He wrote about the discipline of perception, the trained philosophical habit of stripping away our projections, our desires, our wishful thinking, and looking at reality clearly and honestly. That discipline, applied to the question of biological sex, produces an answer that's not politically convenient, but is philosophically unavoidable. Your chromosomes, your gametes, your reproductive anatomy, and the developmental biology locked in from conception are not a mistake. They are not a social construct. They're not an obstacle to your authentic self. They're part of the rational order of nature, as real and as objective as any other fact about the physical world. Now, I want to be precise about something important before we conclude because intellectual honesty demands it. None of these philosophers, not Plato, Aristotle, or the Stoics, were arguing that subjective experiences don't matter. They weren't arguing that suffering isn't real or that psychological distress should be dismissed or mocked. In fact, one of the deepest insights shared across all three traditions is that genuine human suffering deserves genuine philosophical engagement, not dismissal and not empty validation, but serious, honest, rigorous inquiry into its causes and its cure. Socrates spent his entire life in painful, uncomfortable, and often unwelcome conversations with people who didn't want to examine their assumptions, precisely because he believed that examined truth was the only foundation for genuine human flourishing. Aristotle's entire ethical project was aimed at helping human beings understand what they actually need to thrive, which is often very different from what they think they want. And the Stoics built an entire practical philosophy around the distinctions between what feels good and what is actually good because they understood that conflating the two is the root of most human misery. That's the Western philosophical tradition at its best. Not cruelty, not dismissal, not the casual mockery that passes for cultural commentary on much of the internet. It's the true willingness to take human suffering seriously enough to tell it the truth, because the philosophers who built this civilization understood that comfortable lies, however kindly intended, are the most reliable path to deeper suffering, and that honest engagement with reality, however uncomfortable, is the only path to genuine healing. The ancient world didn't have the language of gender dysphoria. It didn't have the DSM-5, the CAS review, or puberty blockers, but it had something arguably more important. It had a coherent, rigorous account of what human beings actually are, what we're for, and what it means to flourish in accordance with our nature rather than in spite of it. And if Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics were sitting in our cultural moment right now, they wouldn't be tweeting outrage or performing political tribalism. They'd be doing what they always did, asking the hard questions, following the argument wherever it leads, and refusing to let uncomfortable feelings substitute for difficult truth. Anyways, that's all for today, and if you've stuck around this long, I thank you. And if this episode gave you something worth thinking about, a framework, a question, or a philosophical lens you hadn't considered before, share it with someone who needs it. Not for the metrics, but because the conversation our civilization needs to have about these topics is more sophisticated than what either side is currently offering, and it needs voices willing to go beyond the cliche talking points. Like and subscribe if you'd like to see more of this content, and we'll see you next time. God bless.